What if I told you that the story of Moses, the man who parted the Red Sea and stood against the Pharaoh of Egypt, is not the only version of history? What if, hidden between the lines of ancient texts and African oral traditions, lies a narrative where Moses himself faced a power so great, so deeply rooted in Africa's spiritual world, that the Bible chose not to tell you? Today, we explore the untold legend, the African god who challenged Moses and won. Transition. To understand this story, we must go back, far back, into the ancient world. The setting: Africa before Moses. Long before Moses walked the deserts, Africa was already a cradle of gods, kings, and myths. The Nile Valley, Nubia, Kush, and regions stretching deep into sub-Saharan Africa were filled with civilizations whose gods were not only worshipped but feared. These deities represented the forces of nature, thunder, fertility, war, and the mysteries of life after death. Among them, one stood out, a figure of immense power, worshipped not just as a spirit, but as the very embodiment of life and death. His name may have changed depending on the tribe or the tongue, but his presence echoed across the continent. He was a god of resilience, a god who commanded storms, a god who punished arrogance. And it was this African god, the legends say, who would one day stand face to face with Moses. Moses and his mission. The Bible tells us that Moses was chosen by the God of Israel to free the Hebrews from Egypt. Armed with divine signs, he challenged Pharaoh and the mighty gods of Egypt. His staff turned into a serpent. His words brought plagues. His faith split the waters of the sea. But what the Bible does not tell you is that Egypt was not an isolated land. It was deeply connected to the spiritual networks of Africa. Pharaohs did not only rely on their own priests, they sought the blessings and powers of neighboring African kingdoms and gods. And it is here, through these connections, that Moses encountered a force beyond Egypt, a deity feared even by Pharaoh himself. The forgotten god of Africa. African oral traditions, carried through generations, speak of a god who was neither fully defeated nor forgotten. Some call him the storm bringer, others the lord of the river, and some, the masked one. His power, they say, could rival any prophet, any magician, and even the God of Israel. When Moses entered the court of Pharaoh, this God's name was whispered in the shadows. He was not a figure Pharaoh could easily dismiss, for his priests drew upon his power. Unlike the gods of Egypt who were tied to temples and idols, this African god was a god of the land itself. He lived in the storms, in the floods, in the heartbeat of the people. And so, the stage was set for a battle not written in the scriptures. The battle the Bible hides. The Bible recounts 10 plagues, each designed to break Egypt's pride. But African tradition hints at an 11th battle, one not written, one erased. When Moses called upon his God to bring destruction upon the Nile, the river turned red with blood. Fish died, and the people cried out. Yet, in African myth, this was not simply a plague, it was a challenge. For the river was under the dominion of the African god. The Nile, stretching deep into the heart of Africa, was his lifeblood. To strike the Nile was to strike him. And so, he rose. Storms gathered. Priests of Pharaoh called upon his name. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment in history, Moses did not face Pharaoh. He faced the god of Africa himself. Who truly won? Biblical texts declare victory for Moses. Yet oral tradition tells a different ending. They claim the African god did not fall. Instead, he absorbed the blow, turned the river back to its flow, and showed that no prophet, not even Moses, could fully erase his presence. This is why, in many African myths, the river remains sacred. It is said that though Moses tried to command it, the Nile remained loyal only to its ancient master. And so, the people whispered, Moses may have won against Pharaoh, but he did not defeat the African god. Why the Bible remained silent? Why would the Bible hide such a tale? The answer is power. The story of Moses is one of dominance, of triumph against oppressors. To admit that Moses met a god he could not defeat would weaken the narrative. And so, silence became strategy. The African god faded from scripture, but not from memory. His stories lived on in chants, rituals, and myths carried from Nubia to the Congo, from the Nile to the forests of West Africa. In the first part of our journey, we uncovered the whispers of a forgotten story, how Moses, the prophet of Israel, faced not just Pharaoh but a god of Africa whose power was tied to the Nile, the storms, and the very soul of the continent. We learned how this god, unbroken by Moses' miracles, continued to live in the memory of African traditions. But the question remains, what happened next? How did this God's influence survive long after the plagues, long after the Exodus, and even long after the Bible chose silence? Let's uncover the continuation of this untold battle. The unyielding power of the African God. After the clash with Moses, African oral traditions say that the god did not retreat into defeat. Instead, he returned deeper into the lands of Africa, beyond the reach of Egypt and Israel. His worshippers believed that he had proven a truth: while men and prophets may pass, the land and its spirit endure forever. This god's name shifted across time and tribes, but his essence remained the same. He was the guardian of rivers, the master of storms, the voice that roared in thunder. He was not bound by a temple or scrolls, he lived wherever the earth and sky met. And so, while Moses' story was written into the Holy Book, the story of the African god lived on through song, chant, and drum. The spread of his legend. Generations after Moses, kingdoms rose and fell across Africa. Nubia, Kush, Aksum, and empires like Mali and Songhai carried forward fragments of ancient worship. Travelers and traders whispered tales of a god who once stood against the prophet of Israel. They described him as a deity not of idols but of raw force, who answered the cries of his people with rain, storms, and protection. In some traditions, he became the thunder god of West Africa. In others, he merged with spirits of rivers and fertility. Each story, though different, carried a common theme: he was never defeated. The fear of the prophets. Religious texts often highlight the triumph of their chosen prophet. Yet, scattered hints suggest that even later prophets felt the weight of Africa's spiritual power. When Hebrew scribes wrote of strange gods, beyond the rivers of Kush, some scholars believe this was a veiled reference to the African deity who had once challenged Moses. His presence was so significant that even silence could not erase him completely. The Bible may not have named him, but the fear of his influence lingered. For the Hebrews, he was a reminder that their God's victory was not always absolute. For Africans, he was a symbol of pride, a God who could stand against the greatest prophets and still remain. Why his story matters. The survival of this God's legend tells us something powerful: history is not only what is written, but also what is remembered. The Bible gave us one version of events, a version where Moses stood alone as the victor. But Africa preserved another version, where their God proved too strong to erase. This duality shows us the power of storytelling itself. Written texts can be controlled, edited, and hidden. But oral traditions, passed from elder to child, cannot be silenced so easily. They carry truths that survive the burning of libraries and the rewriting of history. Legacy in African spirituality. Even today, traces of this God's essence live in African spirituality. In rituals honoring river deities, in ceremonies calling upon thunder and rain, in the deep respect for nature's forces, echoes of the ancient battle remain. For many Africans, these traditions are not about defeat or victory, but balance. The God who challenged Moses is remembered not simply for defiance, but for his reminder that no one voice holds the monopoly on truth. The hidden lesson. So, who truly won, the African God, or Moses? Perhaps the answer lies not in conquest, but in survival. Moses' story was written, preserved, and spread across the world through the Bible. But the African God's story, though untold in Scripture, survived in the hearts and tongues of millions. In one sense, Moses won the moment. In another, the African God won eternity, his presence still alive in the rivers, in the storms, and in the unbroken chain of African memory. Closing reflection. And this, perhaps, is why the Bible remains silent. To admit that Moses faced a God he could not conquer would mean admitting that power does not belong to one faith alone. By leaving his name unwritten, the scriptures tried to erase him. But Africa remembered. So the next time you hear the story of Moses parting the waters, remember that there is another version, a version where the waters belong to someone else, a God who challenged Moses and, in the memory of Africa, walked away unbroken.